Welcome back to Homesteading with the Zimmermans, where we work hard and play hard on our little corner of land in Iowa. My husband and I were born and raised Old Order Mennonite, or horse and buggy Mennonite, as some refer to them as. And although we are no longer part of that culture or community, we are intentional about passing on the old-fashioned skills of our childhood to the next generation. Good morning, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Homesteading with the Zimmermans. Ruth Ann Zimmerman here with a talk on gardening. We have had a little bit of a hint of spring and maybe even summer in the past couple days, and we've done some gardening. And on Instagram, which is where I interact with people on a daily back and forth on a daily basis, I often get the question why we don't do raised beds. And so in today's video, I am going to unpack the differences between in-ground gardens and raised beds, and I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of each one. So personally, we lean heavily towards the in-ground garden, and I'm going to tell you all the reasons why. But I'm also not saying, that does not mean that raised bed gardens are not going to work for you. So this is just to kind of help unpack the differences and what to expect if you're in an area where a raised bed garden is the only way you can garden. So that I'm going to raise some of the challenges for each of the methods, and hopefully this will help you decide which kind of garden you want to have on your property or in your space, and it might also help you troubleshoot some of the issues that have come up with your current garden. So I am making sourdough today as well, so hence the apron, because I've got my timer set. Now I have to run back and forth because sourdough bread takes that kind of tending. Okay, so first of all, you might be leaning towards a raised bed garden if you have physical limitations that keep you from getting down on your hands and knees in the garden or bending over to an in-ground garden. So if that is your limitation, or if you have those issues, that would be one reason to choose an in-ground garden. That would be one reason to choose a raised bed garden. Another reason you might want to choose a raised bed garden is if your soil where you live is clay and you don't want to take the years and years that it takes to amend a clay soil to be more, what's the word? This is where you can tell English is not my primary language. Conducive. If you don't want to take the time that it takes to amend a clay soil to be more conducive to growing a bountiful harvest, then you might want to use raised beds and purchase topsoil and contain it in a raised bed and garden in there. So that could be another reason you're going to choose raised bed. Still another reason to choose a raised bed garden could be that you have moles and voles that are eating, all the roots of or even your seeds before they sprout in an in-ground garden. So with raised beds, then you can line them and the moles and voles cannot get up underneath to steal your roots or your seeds. So that could be another reason you want to choose a raised bed garden. Another reason could be just your space. Maybe you don't own the property where you live and you want to take your gardens with you when you purchase a property or when you move. Or maybe your landlord says you can't, dig up the yard. So that would prevent you from having an in-ground garden. Okay, before I forget, Although this is a gardening video, I am still participating in Michelle's giveaway of a Bosch mixer and a Bosch dehydrator. And as part of the giveaway, we are helping you replace some common store-bought items with from-scratch items. And my contribution to your pantry today is my recipe for ranch mix powder that will replace the packets of ranch seasoning that you can buy. It will replace your ranch dressing or your ranch veggie dip. And you can find all the previously shared recipes and the link to enter the giveaway for a Bosch mixer in my description. There will be a link to Michelle's blog, and she will have all the details for you. So, moving ahead with the garden talk. I covered all the reasons you may be leaning towards a raised bed garden. The reason I did not choose, the reason I dislike raised bed gardens in my area is because we have phenomenal soil. The Midwest, like we live in the middle of the corn and bean belt. Our soil is amazing. And so that's not my issue. You know, I have good soil. I can plant in that soil. I don't need to buy in topsoil or amend it for years to be able to create good soil. And number two, although we do have moles and voles, they take a little bit of what I plant each year, but they definitely do not take the whole harvest. They don't take everything. And what has happened with the moles and voles is normally if the population gets that big, it doesn't take long for bull snakes to move in. And then I'll have snakes for a couple years, but then I don't have my moles and voles. So where we're at right now with my garden is last year I started seeing some damage with moles and voles. So I imagine it won't be long until I start seeing bull snakes again. And bull snakes are harmless. You might not feel like they're harmless if you hear me screaming when I find one in the garden, but they really are harmless. I just try to leave them be because they're eating my moles and voles. So that's kind of a natural cycle of prey and predator that I've seen in my 20 years of gardening. So that's not my issue. I do not, at this time, have any physical limitations. I can get down on my hands and knees and do weeding or planting or harvesting. I actually really, really love to be on my hands and knees in the soil. So I don't have any of those issues. So I'm going to proceed with telling you pros and cons of each. So understanding how a plant matures. So a plant matures by heating degree days. So the number of days listed on your seed packet, say 68 days to maturity, that's not exactly from sunrise to sunset or a 24-hour period. What that means is it's that amount of heating degree days. So on a day that your temperature doesn't get into the 70 degree range, you're not collecting near as many heating degree days as you are on those days where your temperature is 80, 85 degrees. On those days, you're adding up, numerous heating degree days. So when we understand that a plant matures by heat, right? So then we understand that a plant, if your soil is warm or hot, that's going to accumulate more heating degree days. So when a plant matures too fast, it doesn't have the time to grow a root system that can support a lot of fruit. So when you have raised beds, this is my number one reason that I don't like raised beds from experience. When you have raised beds, let's say you have a 18 to 24 inch side and you have 4 sides and then you have your soil all over the top. So I'm sure that some of you mathematicians or some of you that love math are, you can figure out how many cubic inches you have that are exposed to the heat, because the sun beats against all sides of your raised bed and on the top. So yes, I know that your brain is going where I'm leading you. The soil is going to get warm, and what's going to happen, or what happens, is those plants collect heating degree days really fast because that soil is so warm, and the plants mature before their root system has time to really establish to a place where it can support the harvest that I want. So, simple reason is too much heat causes your plants to mature too fast, and when that happens, you don't have as big of a harvest. Now, the time where this would be beneficial is if you live in a climate where it barely gets warm enough to grow things. Then you could use this to your benefit, because you're going to collect a lot more heating degree days by having a raised bed. So if that's you, then you need to consider that maybe if I plant things in raised beds, I would get a harvest, whereas in ground I might not, because they don't collect heating degree days as fast. So one of the ways to combat this problem, if this is your problem, is fertilizer. If you can fertilize your plants well enough, they will develop a big enough root system. It still won't be quite the same. Personally, nutrition-wise, I would prefer for my plants to get their nutrition from the ground rather than fertilizer. Especially, I wouldn't want to use synthetic fertilizer. I would want to use like fish emulsion and very natural fertilizers from a source that I trust. Or if you're into composting, you could make sure that you have a lot of compost and cover that soil at the top, so at least you're insulating some of it from that heat. But that is my main reason for not liking raised beds, is things just mature too fast and I don't get the harvest I want because the root system is not big enough. So the second reason I personally don't like raised bed gardens is all the watering that I have to do. So because your soil is so hot and dries out quicker because of the heat, you have to be very consistent with your watering. Now, I love watering a garden. It's just that I don't like what happens when I use well water to water my plants. I feel like the difference between my plants that I raise on well water versus the plants that live from rainwater is that my plants that live on well water survive, and my plants that live on rainwater thrive. Now, I understand that some of you live in an area where you do not get enough rain, enough precipitation in a growing season, and you do need to water. But personally, for me, in my area, our in-ground gardens rarely, if ever, need water because we get enough of precipitation. So what happens when you use well water, or in some cases you're using city water, is there is calcium and minerals and other things in your water that your plants don't need. So if you have, let's say you have some minerals in your well water, those minerals can bind with things in the soil and make the nutrients that are there less available. And then if you have chlorinated water, like if you have city water, that's an even bigger problem, because that chlorine it can destroy minerals and nutrients that are in your soil that your plants need. And then we go back to the need to fertilize, the need to artificially feed your plants, because you're messing with the natural pH and minerals in the soil by putting well water or city water on your plants or on your soil. So what happens with a natural precipitation, especially in thunderstorms, is that when there's lightning, there's micronutrients in the air. They're floating in the air, and they are in particle sizes that we can't benefit from and our plants can't benefit from. However, when we get a thunderstorm, that lightning and the electricity in the air knocks those nutrients into these tiny, tiny pieces, and then the rain brings them down where the plants can absorb them. The plants absorb them through the soil. All those micronutrients then fall onto the soil with the rain, and the plants absorb them. We eat the plants, and that's how we get those micronutrients that are floating around in the air. So whenever possible, you want plants that can solely survive on precipitation that falls from the sky, just the way God intended it. Not saying that your family can't benefit from vegetables grown in raised beds, but I cannot contain my passion for in-ground gardens. As much as I try to be neutral about this subject, I love a good in-ground garden. The other thing, we're talking about water. One of the reasons that I do not water my in-ground garden more than absolutely necessary is when your plants, let's say a tomato plant, right? So last year we had below average precipitation, and I watched and studied my garden carefully because I did not want to water before it was necessary. So let's take my tomatoes for instance. All through June, they really kind of just sat there. Their leaves weren't curled. We didn't have any rain through most of June. But what I had done when I planted them is I covered the soil up with a thick layer of manure compost and then grass clippings on top of that. So I knew the soil was well insulated from the heat because the plants were not yet big enough to make a lot of shade, right? To shade their roots. But I knew the soil was insulated from the heat, and I knew that all the compost I had put down was trapping the moisture. But what happens when you go through a dry spell, your plant gets the message that it needs water, right? So what is it going to do? It's going to put all of its energy into sending those roots down deep because that's where the moisture is. If you dig in an in-ground garden, even if it hasn't rained for weeks, you can find moisture if you go down far enough. In our area especially. Now I know there is desert type areas that don't have that type of, moisture under the topsoil. And that's when you would water. But what happens is you might think your plant's just sitting there, but it's actually sending down big, long roots into the moisture level that's down there. And also, guess what else it finds all the way down there? It finds extra nutrients that are all the way down there. It's a known fact that dandelions and comfrey have lots of health benefits because they have long, long tap roots that can go down where there are nutrients that most other plants can't access. So when you overwater, when you water your in-ground garden, then you're messing with the plant's natural instincts. I don't know if instincts is the right word, but if you water your garden, you are telling the plant it's okay, you don't need to put your roots all the way down. When the truth is, you really want them to get the message that you need to put your roots all the way down. That's always where your plants will find the most nutrients and be hardy and vigorous, is when they put down deep roots. So that is why, one of the reasons why I love a good in-ground garden, because I know that the roots can go beyond the bottom of the raised bed and they can go down deep and find the nutrients that is going to help the plants be the most vigorous that they can possibly be. And then the other thing is all that rainfall falling on the soil, bringing those micronutrients down. You won't see me, rarely. I've lived long enough to know never to say never. Never say never. But rarely do I use plastic or fabric weed, what is it called? Fabric mulch, plastic mulch, or, weed barrier of that kind that will protect the rainfall from falling all over the soil, because I want those micronutrients that come with the rain to be absorbed by my plants and not run off where the roots aren't. So if you have plastic, and your plant is right here, yes, some of those micronutrients are going to fall on the green leaves and your plant's still going to absorb them, but the rest of it is going to run off of that plastic, and your plant is going to not be able to absorb it unless its roots are all the way out there at the edge. So that is another reason that you won't see me using anything to cover the soil by my plants. But never say never. There might be a time where I do need to use that because I want those micronutrients to be absorbed by my plants. So there is a little bit of my passion for in-ground gardening. So one of the other reasons is when you're in-ground gardening, your roots will go down where it's cool. And you can plant your crops so that they can shade make a canopy, and that keeps your ground cool. You can cover it with compost. You want your plant to mature at a natural rate, not an unnatural rate of a lot of heat, because to bear a lot of fruit, your plant needs to have a good root system. And when you have a good root system, when the plant has taken the time to develop a good root system, then you know that it is vigorous enough to support the kind of harvest that you want. So one of the downfalls of an in-ground garden, or one of the negatives of an in-ground garden, is your yard can creep in, or weeds, or sometimes you'll have that real aggressive grass that sends out these razor sharp roots that can creep in and take over your in-ground garden. And I have a video on edge control, and I'll link that video. Edge control is weed control, is what I always say. And that's one of my biggest battles for an in-ground garden, is keeping those edges maintained so the yard does not take over. Now, like I said, where we live, the prairie will take back the ground in one season if you're not consistent, because we live in such a climate with the kind of soil where everything just grows so vigorously. And if I'm not consistent with my in-ground garden, the prairie will just take it back. It won't take long at all. There'll be trees and brambles and weeds and grass. They're all just waiting and pressuring my in-ground garden. They'll just take it over. So that is one of my biggest battles with an in-ground garden that you wouldn't have with raised beds. Now, one of the ways that you can compromise, and we've started doing some gardening this way, is with a border garden. So with a border garden, it's kind of a halfway between, it's in ground, yet you have a border where you don't have the pressure of your yard, or the prairie as I call it, trying to creep in. So with border gardens, they're not really raised. You have a border, anywhere from 6 to 8 inches high. But the difference is there's no barrier in the bottom. So your plants can still put their roots down into the natural soil. So we've done some of that for blueberries. And the reason we've done it for our blueberries is because we need to amend that soil to be more acidic than our natural soil. So we can contain that soil and make just that soil acidic. Another reason we've done a border garden is our strawberries. We're trying to put our strawberries in a border garden just because when I put my strawberries in an in-ground garden, I usually put it at the edge of the garden, and then the pressure from the yard tends to crowd out the strawberries as the grass and the weeds just kind of move into the strawberries territory. And then this year I'm using those border gardens for some of my brassicas and lettuce, some of my early garden things, and then I'll probably put some herbs and things like that in those border gardens. So that is one of the ways that we've found to fight back against the battle of the prairie, is by using border gardens. And we will, I've done border gardens before and liked it, but then the boards rotted and I was back to battling the yard. So that is kind of a compromise, is a border garden. You could do a border garden if your battle is the same as my battle, which is maintaining those edges. So if you are new to gardening, please do not get overwhelmed with all the options that are out there. Try one way. And if after a couple years you're not happy with it, try a different way. The best way to garden is to just do it, because without any experience under your belt, you're going to be exactly at this same place next year with trying to make decisions. It's much better to jump in and just try it some way. And if the easiest way is for you to get a raised bed and put some seeds in it and water it every day, then absolutely rather do that than wait until you can have an in-ground garden. I'd rather see you gain some experience than just wait and wait, because Ruth Ann says she likes an in-ground garden. By all means, if getting a raised bed garden is the only way that you're going to garden, have a garden this year, then absolutely do a raised bed garden and put some seeds in it and water it, and don't doubt yourself. Just any way that you can learn to grow food for your family or for yourself is going to be a win. Okay, to conclude this video, I am going to show you some clips of just scenes around the farm from the nice weather that we've had, and we've had a beautiful mound of rain. I'm so happy that all my early crops are in the garden, and now we can just sit and wait until we get a little closer to our frost date, which is May 15th. And once we get into that area, then we can think about planting our frost-sensitive crops like tomatoes and peppers and beans and corn. Some of those crops we will put out when we get closer to our frost date and we can see the forecast. But that's probably going to be early May before we get back into the garden.